Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to some of those who are not from Manchester and may be here for the conference. My name's Will Stone. I am the Communications Engagement Manager for the Faculty of Humanities. And together with Kim Dunn, wherever Kim is, from RSPB and EPI, we've put this event on for you. So hopefully it'll be really thought-provoking, stimulating, and you'll see a lot of the expertise which is sat here in the room. Please turn your mobile phones off if you can, or put them onto silent. You probably have done it and now you've got to check. There should be no fire alarms. If there is, our team will lead you out. There are fire escapes. And I'm not going to do my best cabin crew, but to the left of me and at the back of the room. And the toilets are just up at the left outside the lecture theatre as well. So thank you for joining us. I hope you've had something to eat and drink. And now I'd like to hand over to our Vice President for Social Responsibility, Nalin Thakkar.
Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to you all. Very warm welcome to those who are particularly from outside Manchester. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening at the business school and to see such a rich mix of voices gathered in the room from business, government, conservation, finance, and academia. Thank you for making time to join us and for your interest in what is one of the most defining challenges of our time, how we ensure economic activity does not simply minimize harm to nature, but actively contributes to its recovery. I'm delighted to welcome colleagues and partners from DEFRA, Lloyds Bank, the RSPB, United Utilities, Wildlife Trusts, UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, and from across the university, particularly the Alliance Manchester Business School and the School of Environment, Education, and Development. The fact that so many perspectives are represented here tonight is important because biodiversity loss is not a challenge that any one sector can solve. This evening also feels especially significant because it takes place against the backdrop of IPBES 12 being hosted here in Manchester this week, with delegates from around 150 countries in the city. Manchester is quite literally at the center of global conversation about nature, evidence, and action. That matters enormously, and it makes gatherings like this one all the more timely. As Vice President for Social Responsibility at this university and with responsibility for environmental sustainability, I'm particularly proud our institution is playing in convening these conversations. Universities have a unique responsibility and a privilege, not just to generate knowledge, but to develop the next generation of responsible citizens and change makers, and also help translate that knowledge into action, policy, and practice. Without meaning to sound grandiose or something out of DC or Marvel comics, universities are, in a sense, the guardians of the future. Here at the university, biodiversity and ecosystems are central to both our research mission and our civic purpose. The city, of course, has a complex relationship with nature. 2 centuries ago, Manchester stood at the heart of industrial revolution, a period of extraordinary innovation and prosperity, but also one that came with profound environmental cost. Rivers were polluted, landscapes degraded, and ecosystems pushed to their limits. Yet Manchester's story did not end there. What is equally powerful is the story of recovery, restoration, leadership that followed, a story that continues today. Our researchers are deeply involved in restoring degraded peatlands across the region, helping to lock away carbon, improve water quality, and rebuild habitats. Others are working on green infrastructure, landscape ecology, and rewilding, showing how nature recovery can strengthen resilience in the face of climate and economic shocks. Manchester has also a long and proud connection to the conservation movement itself. Fletcher Moss in Didsbury, known to many for its beautiful botanical gardens, was also home to one of the founders of RSPB. This story reminds us that this city has long been a place where ideas about nature, community, and responsibility take root and grow. Today, that legacy is carried forward through our Manchester 2035 strategy, which places social responsibility and sustainability and partnership at the heart of everything we do. We are committed to being a values-led university, one that works alongside business, policymakers, and communities to tackle global challenges, including biodiversity loss. Across the university, our academics are helping organizations understand nature-related risks, design nature-positive strategies, and embed ecological thinking into economic decision-making. This work sits at the intersection of science, business, and policy, precisely where it needs to be if we are to move from aspiration to implementation. And we are equally committed to practicing what we research through initiatives such as the Meadowbridge Solar Farm, which now supplies a significant proportion of the university's electricity and incidentally results in net biodiversity gain of the site. We are aligning our own operations with our sustainability ambitions. These are tangible examples of how institutions can turn long-term commitments into real-world impact. The evidence is now very clear. Over half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. Biodiversity loss is therefore not only an environmental crisis, it is an economic one. And that is why the work emerging from IPBES, particularly the business and biodiversity assessment, is so important. It gives businesses a robust science-based framework to understand their dependence on nature, assess risks, and crucially, identify opportunities to act. Education also has a vital role to play. Across Alliance Manchester Business School and the School of Environment, Education and Development, colleagues are preparing the next generation of leaders to operate confidently at the interface of business and biodiversity. I'm particularly pleased that we have recently launched a new Master's in Nature Recovery, Rewilding and Restoration, a program that speaks directly to the skills and leadership we will need in the years ahead. Tonight is really about us coming together to learn from the science, to learn from each other, and to be honest about the challenges as well as the opportunities. It is about recognizing that biodiversity recovery is not a side project or nice to have, but a core part of long-term organization resilience and sustainable prosperity. Let me finish by saying a few thank yous. Thank you to our partners at RSPB for co-hosting this event. Thank you to our speakers from DEFRA, Lloyds Bank, Wildlife Trust, United Utilities, and UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening, for the work you're already doing, and for the role you'll continue to play in shaping a more nature-positive future. I hope this evening sparks new ideas, strengthens partnerships, and gives us all confidence to be a little bolder in the actions we take. This is the decade that will define the century. Our choices now, together, will determine whether we hand future generations a world that is diminished or a world that is repaired. Thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Andrea Ledward, CBE, Director of International Biodiversity and Climate at DEFRA.
Hello, everybody. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you again, more from me, to both the RSPB and the Alliance Manchester Business School for hosting. As someone who grew up only 40 minutes away from here, I grew up in Stoke-on-Trent, so Manchester and the Peak District have always been real favourite places for me. Well, I have to admit, arriving in Manchester Piccadilly this morning, I got that same thrill I used to get when I was on my way to Affleck Palace or Old Trafford. So it was a great start to the day. So I hope everyone has enjoyed Stakeholder Day so far. It's certainly been the largest Stakeholder Day for IPBES ever. And actually, it's the first time there's ever been a parallel programme around the IPBES plenary. So we're hoping we have set a new precedent, and going forward, that is going to be repeated. So the UK government was keen to host ITBES 12 in Manchester for 3 reasons. So firstly, nature is actually very central to the government's plan for change and the economic growth trajectory. Secondly, we wanted to really showcase the strength of UK science. And thirdly, we really wanted to try and harness the creation and the innovation in the UK business community and give a platform for that. I was lucky enough to have responsibility to make all that happen, and I'm really thankful to my team who are in this room today to help them make this all reality. So I'm going to talk in 3 parts. The first bit's about the centrality of nature. So we all know that a resilient global economy depends on a healthy natural world. Yet ecosystems are deteriorating at a pace that threatens economic stability. Nature underpins trillions of dollars in economic value and provides essential services such as clean water, climate regulation, food security, public health, and its continued loss is already disrupting supply chains, raising commodity prices and increasing systemic risk. Hopefully you've seen the UK's recent ecosystem assessment, which identified 6 critical ecosystems that would, if they collapsed, drive the displacement of millions, change global weather patterns, increase global food and water scarcity, and drive geopolitical competition for the remaining resources. Biodiversity loss could reduce the UK GDP by 6 to 12%, an impact comparable to the 2008 financial crisis or COVID-19, but it would be irreversible. 40% of UK food is imported, and 1/4 of this is from the Mediterranean, for example, an area really increasing under climate stress. So global ecosystem decline really poses a direct threat to our own economic stability, food security, and food prices here. But there are also critical opportunities. Nature's a strategic economic asset. It contributes over £1.8 trillion to the UK economy and supports a bioeconomy worth about £220 billion annually. And it employs about 5.2 million people in the UK. Delivers about £400 billion in health benefits through improved physical and mental well-being. This afternoon, we heard some incredibly powerful examples from the Chinese government about how they are investing in the bioeconomy. It's producing billions of yuan profit from both ecotourism and tea production, they were telling us about, in bamboo forests in Zhejiang province. So secondly, thinking about how we use science now to underpin our policy making. What we've tried to do is create a parallel programme of events in Manchester and around the country this year to raise awareness of ITBES and its landmark assessments. We hope to strengthen the link between science and policy and accelerate action as a result of the assessment, specifically by showcasing the action already underway. I know that one of the authors of the Business and Biodiversity Assessment, Katie Leach, will speak after me, and she'll introduce the assessment as much as she can at this point in greater depth. But the Business and Biodiversity Assessment really will strengthen the knowledge base to support efforts by business to really deliver the 2050 vision for biodiversity and the objectives of the CBD. So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about the UK government's ambition that was set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan in December last year to work alongside individuals and communities and businesses to really achieve our nature ambition. So in England, we've already established a high integrity domestic nature market through biodiversity net gain, and by creating the woodland, carbon and peatland codes. And these are really creating the conditions for greater private sector investment in nature. And so what that means is we're trying to incentivize businesses to recognise and pay for nature's services through improved corporate reporting and nature positive pathways. And the Green Finance Institute, WWF UK and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology are working very hard with businesses to develop nature positive transition pathways for the UK economy, which will create these very sector-specific roadmaps. And I encourage you really to engage with that work. If you go on the GFI website, it's free for people to kind of join and participate as organisations. Secondly, we've been looking at safeguarding integrity through developing nature investment standards and consultations on voluntary carbon and nature market governance. We've been building, thirdly, project pipelines through investment readiness and local natural capital programmes. And then finally, we've been trying to think about blended finance approaches with landscape recovery and the forthcoming Big Nature Impact Fund. But we haven't just been doing it at home, because much of the learning that can take place is really happening overseas. So we've also been working on the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, which was co-created between the UK and France to create an international platform for high integrity biodiversity approaches. We've also been one of the largest donors and supporters of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, supporting the uptake phase now on voluntary adoption in many different sectors and geographies. And more than 730 organisations have now voluntarily adopted the recommendations. We've really committed as the UK to think about how we can now adopt that framework into UK policy and regulation. So when we look ahead, I was asked to think, what does it mean for us as UK government? So the first thing is we heard this morning, if many of you were in that big plenary, about the next step needs to be reach, uptake and impact. So on reach, after IPBES 12, the UK government's going to continue to convene and support conversations with business, civil society and partners across government to champion the assessment's insights. I was struck this morning, only 4% of the stakeholders that they surveyed last year were from business or industry. I'm hoping as a result of this assessment, it might be slightly higher than 4% in the future as we really start to penetrate into the business community with awareness. Then on uptake, I'm really looking forward to the Aviva and DEFRA led Business and Biodiversity Day on Wednesday, where we're really going to spotlight the action that's already underway and encourage businesses to really collaborate and build each other's confidence, whether it's strengthening supply chains, whether it's maximising the opportunities in the bioeconomy, or whether it's just increasing transparency and disclosure. We're already also looking ahead to CBD COP17 later this year. That's going to be in Armenia. We're going to be looking at progress against the global biodiversity framework, looking at synergies with climate change, and we're going to be finalising the mechanisms for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits and digital sequence information. The Cali Fund received its first contribution from a UK AI startup, TerraViva AI, which is based very close to here in Manchester. And finally, on impact, I think that's where we need to all really work together to ensure that there's equity in data and monitoring and access to finance, but also to build confidence. We need to keep telling stories about impact and telling stories about opportunity. So in summary, I think if this is your first time engaging with IPBES, I hope you'll leave Manchester with an awareness of the range of scientific reports and knowledge available and a sense of the potential communities and collaboration ahead and a real commitment to make change happen. But I also hope that you want to stay involved in the parallel programme after IPBES 12, focused on the business and biodiversity assessment. You'll find more information on the JNCC website, if that's what you'd like to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And now we'd like to introduce Katie Leach, IPBES author and head of nature at Lloyds Bank.
Thank you. This one working. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in Manchester since Friday, so it's been great to already enjoy Manchester and welcome so many of you here. So in my day job, I'm head of nature at Lloyds Banking Group. But alongside that, over the past 3 years, I've been a coordinating lead author on the IPBES Business and Biodiversity Assessment. You'll hear a lot probably through the week about the different chapters and how it's made up. I'm not able to go into like the specifics of the assessment right now. But my role is in chapter 6. So chapter 6 is all about how do we create an enabling environment for business to take action? It's all about the role of different actors like government, the financial system, Indigenous people and local communities and civil society, and how everyone comes together. And of course, academia is a really key part of this as well. So it's great to be here tonight to talk about it. So I think if you're here, you probably roughly know what IPBES is, but maybe you've been hearing about this assessment and you're like, what is this? How do I get my head around it? So I was going to talk a little bit about the background and how we've got here. So IPBES is more or less like an IPCC, but for nature. There's more than 150 member states that come together to agree this assessment. And it's actually the 15th assessment that IPBES has put together over the past few years. But this is the first of its kind. It's the first assessment that's ever looked at the role of business and biodiversity and how they come together. It's also been a really interesting assessment because it's a fast track assessment. So for IPBES, 3 years is fast. So we've only actually had 2 meetings where we've come together in person. So it's been a speedy process. We haven't had much time to put this together. But for IPBES, it's been great to trial it and great to see how this is. And one of the main reasons for so this assessment comes in response to government saying, look, we need to better understand how business intersects with biodiversity. And so then they wanted this to be a fast track assessment so that we get the outcomes to those who need it as quick as possible. Also important thing to note is that it's a methodological assessment. So we don't cover everything between business and biodiversity. It's purely looking at the methods. So we're looking at ways that you can measure the impacts and dependencies of business on biodiversity. We've been doing it over 3 years. There's been a huge evidence base that we can draw from here. There's been 80 experts that have been involved, people like me that come from the business space, people from academia, from NGOs, just a broad range of people. We also had 2 workshops with Indigenous people and local communities in Colombia and in Africa as well, to try and really make sure that the Indigenous people voice is coming through in the assessment and actually carries through the whole thing. And another really important thing for me, so this is my first IPBES assessment, but one of the really interesting pieces is that it's co-designed with government. So we come together to do this. We've had government input throughout the process, throughout the fast track, and we'll continue to, over the course of this week, co-design the final assessment with governments. What you can expect to see is, in my perspective, it's the scientific evidence to back up probably what many of us are working on already around business and the interactions with nature, but really being able to look at these impacts and dependencies and how do we measure them, and then importantly, what actions can be taken off the back of it. There's a lot of IPBES jargon that you might come across during the week, but one of the things that we will have at the end of Monday next week is a summary for policymakers. The summary for policymakers, the way it's set up is that we have 10 key messages that really highlight to all actors, policymakers, but we also hope that it'll be really relevant to business too, around, the role that business has, the measurement that can be taken, and then the action off the back of that, the action of business, but also the action by all actors. And it has this sort of supporting messages that look at understanding the relationship between business and nature, about the actions that can be taken by businesses and by other actors, and then actually how do you measure that? So looking across this whole sort of universe of measures. And that measurement piece is what is really important and where we're really bringing that scientific evidence base forwards. To give a sort of separate example from my day job at Lloyd's, we know that measurement is really important in everything we do. We've been understanding our impacts and dependencies on biodiversity through across the banking portfolio. And where we've been focusing firstly is to look at farming, because Lloyd's banks a third of UK farmers. So we've been looking at how do they impact on nature? How do they depend on nature? Looking across the UK. And through this, it's become so important for us to be looking at measurement and the different ways that we can look at that. And so we recently put out a report called Farming with Nature, where we look at how do we take these different measurement approaches and how can we use those to try and do a TNFD aligned report. It's not looking at the whole of TNFD, but it's sort of starting to look at that. But really for agriculture, what's important is being able to look at location and location-based observation. So really starting from bottom up and being able to understand what are those impacts and dependencies. And geospatial data is one of the things that's been really important for us to do that. And I would just say that, it's the taking action. So we use the measurement, but we want to take action off the back of it. And so for someone like a Lloyd's banking group, how do we then translate that into financial products and instruments? And that's what we've been looking at over the past sort of 6 months or so. We've done this TNFD assessment. How do we now actually encourage farmers to transition? And so we recently launched an agricultural transition product for farmers to access loans around this and supporting the transition. So I was asked to leave you with a challenge coming out of here. I know I haven't been able to talk about the specifics of the assessment, But what I really hope is that you're here and you're interested in this assessment and what businesses can do. So I'd encourage you all to think about how you can all work together. Andrea mentioned, but what's really important for us as the authors is about the impact and the uptake of this. We're working on a sort of document that translates the summary for policymakers for a business audience, which we think is going to be really helpful off the back of this. But I'd encourage you all to have a look at, how can you all work together? Collaborative action is really important by a range of different actors. We've got a range of different actors here, from policy to academia to civil society and business. How can you all work together to help scale up the uptake and the impact of this assessment? And that would be great for all of us that have been involved in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So now we've got our panel session. And if you notice in the top right-hand corner is a QR code. We have Mentimeter, and my colleague Erin is going to coordinate those. So if you don't get a chance to ask a question, or you want to ask a question secretly, you can do that via Mentimeter. And at the end, we've got another QR code for the word cloud, and we really like you to sort of contribute to that. So I'm going to hand over to Katie Jo, who is chair, and she'll introduce everybody. Thank you, Kate.
Hi there, everyone. It's so exciting to be here today. I'm Katie Jo Luxon. I'm the Global Conservation Director with the RSPB. We have got so many brilliant projects that offer hope on how we can recover nature. But that's the problem. They're projects. What we need is scale. And what we need is systemic change. So that's why we're here tonight and why the RSPB has sponsored this event, because we can't carry on meeting this challenge with a bunch of projects. We want to change the whole system, and we want to change the world. So that's why you're here tonight, guys. A small challenge. And we're really excited about the IPBES process, because we're an organisation that is grounded in science and policy and practice. And that is what IPBES is giving us, this connection between the science, the evidence, the policy, and then it is our job as civil society and businesses to work together to take that out into impact in practice. So this is a really important week for us here in Manchester, and we think that this will be a critical moment to take this forward from here on in. And I just wanted to say it's really exciting that you're all here with us tonight, and that we've got some panel guests who I shall be introducing to you and asking them some tricky questions, and you will get your chance, I hope, at the end to ask them questions too. But this feels like a really key moment. So just before we plunge in, I do want to say thank you to Nalin, who hosted us here at the Manchester Business School. This is, a really, really key event to have and have your leadership in this space from both Nalin himself and the whole business school in Manchester, and to Andrea as well, Andrea Ledward, who has been at the core of the UK government's IPBES processes all the way through, but also on climate and nature internationally for a long time. And, working in nature conservation, it's been quite a tough time. We're not achieving everything we want to achieve, and there has been talk of nature being a blocker to growth. And I really hope that some of the language we will get out of the next few days of this report, we can really challenge that, because I think we know that it isn't the case that nature will build our resilience and our full prosperity in the long run as well. So we're really looking forward to the UK government's response when IPBES 12 comes out, and there will be a great opportunity for collaboration after that. And thank you to Casey. We're really keen to read Chapter 6. I think Chapter 6 is going to be key. So thank you for all your work on this huge programme, but also to Lloyds Bank for some of their fantastic leadership in this space. So just to introduce the panel here today, I'm delighted that Edward Pollard is able to join us in the middle here from the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. You're a director for that, and Edward's kindly stepped in as a colleague couldn't make it. So very big thanks to Edward. We've got Dr. Tom Burdett next to me, who is the Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust for Lancashire, Manchester and North Merseyside, but also involved in the fantastic Nature North collaboration. We've got Javed Siddiqui, who is the Professor of Accounting and Alliance at Manchester Business School and also a Director of the Social Responsibility at the University here in Manchester. We've got Joe Harrison here from United Utilities, who is the Asset Management Director, and I'm delighted we've worked together with United Utilities for some time in partnership on catchment management. So some great examples that Joe will be sharing. And last but not at all least, we've got Anna Gilchrist, who is a lecturer here in Manchester on environmental management and ecology. So thank you so much for all of them for joining us. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off with a question to you, Edward, if that's all right, first of all. What do you see as the key drivers for engagement for business on biodiversity? And how do we get the urgency happening?
Oh. Thank you, and welcome everyone. I wish when I used to attend lecture theatres we could bring glasses of wine in with us as well. The drivers, many friends in the audience and around here, we've been looking at the drivers for business action for biodiversity for years now, and they ebb and flow. If you'd asked me this question 2 or 3 years ago, I'd said regulation, everyone was keen on EU regs like CSRD. That's very much on the back burner right now with the world we're in. I think the flip of that in the last 6 to 12 months, we've been hearing increasingly about resilience. And this penny drop moment, this realization that, you know what, a vast majority of the world's companies need functional ecosystems, need nature just to operate. You know, this isn't a nice to have, it's an absolute fundamental. And it staggers me that some of the companies are only just waking up to this. It's like, what did you think you did if it didn't depend on biodiversity? So I think that's really coming through. We can really lean into that. I think that is in turn being recognized by financial institutions. And obviously we've had Katie here and there's others in the audience. I think they're now starting to ask questions, realizing particularly institutional investment. If we want our investment, if we want these companies that we're investing millions into to still be here in 10, 15, 20 years time, we've got to make damn sure that they are caring for their impacts and their dependencies on nature, because otherwise they are going to go under. So those, I think, is what we're really seeing. I think there's hopes, there's market differentiation, that some companies think, oh, well, you know, if we can sort ourselves out and manage our impacts and dependencies better, we're going to be more attractive to buyers at any point on the value chain, not just the outward consumer-facing side, but along the chain. How can we get the urgency across? I wish I knew. You know, we've been having this, I've been involved with these sort of conversations for 15, 20 years, and, you know, the fact that we are in this room shows that something has landed. You know, this meeting wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, or it would have been a meeting of 12 of us in the pub. So something's coming. This is a great event. IPBES 12 is exciting. So I don't know how we can really make the picture any clearer. We've got national security reports saying the world's going to collapse into civil unrest unless we fix the biodiversity crisis. You know, and if that doesn't get people to sit up, I don't know what will, but we just keep on plugging away and people are picking up the right story.
Certainly feels to me like even if the media doesn't pick this up, this kind of collaboration that we're generating on the back of the IPBES report is really quite exciting and, you know, could burst through at the moment. I'm going to turn to you, Tom, actually, because you're doing some really interesting work with a huge partnership in this Nature North, trying to develop the kind of propositions that businesses could invest in. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that, how you've developed it, and what stakeholders are involved?
Yeah, sure. So Nature North initially was a collaboration of all the nature organisations in the north of England, so across the NGO sector, but also Natural England and the Environment Agency. And the idea was that by working together, we would sort of scale up nature's recovery. So actually, we've already kind of answering Katie's challenge, really. So it's about doing it bigger, but also about trying to advocate with politicians and policymakers and businesses for the importance of nature, in its underpinning of the North's economy, and also developing routes for private finance in particular to be funding nature recovery. And it's been incredibly well received. I think early on I didn't actually need to register for IPBES. They saw my lanyard with Nature North and they genuinely said, "Oh, it's fine, you can just go in." So I can actually bypass security at international events, which is quite amazing. But I think that was the starting point. I think what's been increasingly obvious as we've reached out beyond our sort of what's the word, echo chamber of the environment sector, is that we've grown Nature North now into other sectors as well. So one of the big pieces of work I've been leading on is called Green Northern Connections, and that's working with linear infrastructure organizations. So particularly transport and energy. We have water in there as well. And actually what's really lovely is the way that those sectors are now very much feeling part of the Nature North family. We've brought them in. So we didn't start engaging those other sectors by starting with why we thought nature was important and our vision for nature connectivity across the north of England. We started by asking them how nature could actually be of value to them in their businesses with their outcomes and their objectives. And it was really, really interesting because I think we started out thinking very much around voluntary carbon markets and biodiversity net gain and corporate social responsibility. But what the bit that's really landed, the core message that's really landed is what Edward mentioned. It's the word resilience. So what we're finding is the organizations want to work with us as Nature North as a kind of single point of contact with what can be a very confusing nature sector for the business community. But they understand, and we are increasingly working with them to understand how the risk of their infrastructure, so it might be wildfire or heat, it might be flooding or erosion. Increasingly, we're now getting into the kind of whole supply chain resilience and also water supply as well for industries that need to extract water. So it's understanding and promoting projects, nature projects, which can deliver those resilience benefits, including, I might come back to it later, I don't want to monopolize, but some really kind of niche things. And you're thinking, wow, I never would have thought that nature can solve a problem with substations short-circuiting or railway signals from being blocked.
That definitely does sound intriguing. We might have to come back to that. I mean, there's a theme here emerging about the language we use and finding language that resonates. And I think sometimes we are in our own little echo chambers of talking in the language that works for our sector. And I think one of the real challenges here is finding that connection into the business sector and speaking their language and maybe them starting to understand a little bit more about the nature language that the NGO and the public sector are using. So perhaps I will come to you next, Javed, if I may, to ask about how you find working with business on this agenda. How do you feel they're rising to this challenge we're facing? And perhaps where are the big areas of opportunity you think we should focus on?
Thank you. I think there has been genuine change in terms of aspirations and ambitions of the businesses. In terms of actual action, it has been more uneven. So when you talk about nature-based companies, United Utilities, for example, they've taken it very seriously in terms of incorporating biodiversity in their actual financial model. So when they talk about capital allocation decisions, they talk about biodiversity. And similarly, if you look at regulations, we have got the TNFD and then the European regulations around measurement. I'm very happy that Katie talked about measurement because I'm an accountant. So when I talk about measurement, nobody listens. So I think it's important to understand that measurement is the key driver to change. So business will understand that language more than anything else. Unfortunately, the way the businesses have evolved over the years, the focus has always been on profit and on financial terms. So if you look at the structures that we have got, corporate governance in terms of accountability, even assurance, everything is aimed at those numbers. So it's a challenge to make the businesses understand the value, the real value of taking care of the ecosystem, because in the longer term, that is the businesses we are talking about. Within the business school, we have got this notion of treating the business as a force for good. It's all good talking about that philosophy, but actual change will only occur when we can establish this link between aspirations and actions. And that will only happen when the structures start catching up with the top.
That's really interesting because, at the core of this is treating nature as an externality that has no cost and is provided to business for free. So finding those businesses where they already see the value of nature and leaning into that. I mean, our water companies are the biggest environmental companies in the UK. So, Joe, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of your experience in United Utilities? You're a stalwart of the sector in United Utilities, but you've led the way on catchment management projects. What have you learned from that experience?
So thank you very much. I think, just to sort of make sure that everybody sort of understands, I suppose, I mean, we think that, the interaction with nature is absolutely fundamental to the way a water company works. So we absolutely rely on well-functioning ecosystems to protect our water quality, but also the quantity of water that we have available to us. But we also need well-functioning ecosystems to ensure that we can discharge treated effluent back into the natural environment once it's gone through all of its processes. So managing the environment that holistically is absolutely critical to the way a water company works. And most water companies own quite a lot of land, and that's really to protect water quality around their reservoirs. United Utilities is a custodian of 57,000 hectares of land. So we're the biggest corporate landowner in the UK. And most of that land is upland land around our reservoirs. So we talked earlier on about the impact of the Industrial Revolution around the sort of the northern cities. And it really had a very dramatic impact on peatland in particular and some of our upland habitats. And what we saw more than 20 years ago was that was resulting in water that was really quite coloured as peatland degraded, and was potentially going to cause us an issue in terms of our water treatment. So we had two options. We could either invest in modern technology and high-tech solutions that were energy intensive and intensive in terms of chemical use, or we could look at the source of that colour and try and stop the erosion and the degradation of peatland. And that was the route that we chose over 20 years ago. And so we've been working with partners like the RSPB, but also the wildlife trusts over that sort of time to develop what we call a sustainable approach to catchment management. And so that's a lot of it is around peatland restoration, but also with that obviously comes the whole sort of ecosystem that sort of becomes much more flourishing in those sort of situations. And it obviously brings much bigger benefits to us now when we start to look at the impact of climate change. Over the last sort of 6 so years within the Northwest region, we've had some of our driest summers and some of our wettest winters, and being able to cope with those extremes of weather means that if you have restored ecosystems, they are just so much more robust. And one of the projects that we sort of launched way back in the early 2000s was the restoration of one of the valleys in the Lake District called Ennerdale. And that project was called Wild Ennerdale, and we worked very closely with Natural England and the Forestry Commission to really rewild that valley around a reservoir there. And many of you will remember that we had some very devastating storms back in 2015, a storm called Storm Desmond, and it had a devastating impact across Cumbria in particular. Many, many communities were flooded. And in some of our reservoirs where we hadn't restored the landscape, we had very, very detrimental impacts, and we couldn't use the water because of the level of turbidity and the damage within the catchment. But at Ennerdale, where we had really worked very collaboratively with other stakeholders and we had rewilded, the storm passed through virtually in an unscathed way through that valley. And so we've learned huge lessons from that. And now we're working with lots of organisations to try and replicate that. So we're working with the RSPB on our Haweswater catchment and across the Pennines and the Peak District as well. So that sort of idea of resilient catchments really is the underpin of how we're trying to do business. But it's not just about restoring the uplands that supply water to great cities like Manchester. It's also about how we look at some of today's problems that water companies are experiencing. Many of you will have heard about storm overflows and the frequency by which overflows operate. Well, overflows are on what we call combined sewers, so sewers that take rainwater and sewage. And the overflow doesn't operate because there's too much sewage. The overflows operate because there's too much rainfall. And that rainfall is going unchecked into our systems. So our focus really now is to take that learning that we've got around delivering nature-based solutions on our uplands and think about how do we apply that to the lowlands, to our city regions, and think about how we separate rainwater out of our systems and create, really, great ecosystems within those urban areas to actually manage that rainwater in a different way. So we call that catchment systems thinking, and we're taking a place-based approach. And we're really trying to drive the way our regulators think as well, because for a long time in the water industry, we've thought about water quality, water quantity, and water resources very, very separately. And we can't do that anymore. We need to think about integrated water management in a place-based way to get the right solutions and deliver multiple benefits.
Yeah, some great examples there, Joe. Really exciting. I'm interested though, you use different language about restoration and rewilding. And I'm going to come to you now, Anna, because you've got a brand new course here in Manchester as an MSc, which is called a Nature Recovery, Restoration and Rewilding. So I'm intrigued to know, what do you see as those differences, and tell us about this course, because this is going to be key to skill up the next generation to take on the challenges that Joe has just described.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So first of all, I need to acknowledge that up there it says that I am the program director for the MSc, and we're going to call it NR3 just for short, because that's the lingo. Okay, I'm not the program director. I am the co-program director. And Dr. Ian Thornhill, my colleague, is in the room. So if I didn't say it, I'd get into trouble. And it absolutely has been a teamwork, is bringing this MSc to fruition. So the difference between the three, I think, is recognizing that there is different language, and actually that language can invite different markets, different organizations, different people involved. And I thought it was partly about that. Originally, it was actually recovery and rewilding. And we were encouraged by our then head of skill to bring in restoration, because it brought in a different way of thinking. And yeah, there were different ways of seeing whether that is more nature recovery, which is looking at the industries or businesses that have kind of perhaps traditionally done damage to nature, and how we bring those back into the fold to actually make them be positive for nature. Whether we're looking at restoration, which is returning ecosystems back to the state once they've been damaged by human activities, how we can bring them back to the conditions. And rewilding, which is probably the most radical, the most controversial, but actually also the most, for me, the most exciting, but also the most long-term, which is really this more open-ended approach. So it's trying to look at the full family of the ways in which we can do it. And why did we do it? Well, with my business hat on, it was market gap. If you look at the range of different degrees that are out there on nature, the majority look at conservation biology, ecology, zoology. They're all very deeply embedded in the natural sciences. Or you go to the other side and maybe they're on wildlife photography and very much in the arts. But actually, IPBES have said for transformative change, we need action across technological, political, social, all areas. And we really wanted to develop a degree that really tried to do that really tried to look across. So on a curriculum level, it's very much a curriculum that spans both the natural sciences and the social sciences, and tries to bring those things together within course units themselves, but also course units that specialize in them slightly separately. The other thing which we really stuck to our guns, and maybe the university weren't overly convinced by at the start, was that our intake could be from any background. So we have no disciplinary requirement. People have and come, and there was some in the audience today, from engineering through to linguistics, from music through to all aspects, as well as and about 50% of our cohort are from a kind of non-natural science background. And ultimately that then means that our graduates will go out into a variety of different careers and areas and be able to advocate for nature. And the hope for the degree, I guess, is that one is that it's hopeful, it's optimistic, it's solutions oriented. It's about really trying to look at how we fix this problem and not talk about the problem that we've created. And I think that's really important for the next generation, where eco-anxiety is something that is deeply embedded in them, understandably, from the problem of my generation and previous generations. And ultimately, what we want to do is create graduates that can go out there and advocate on behalf of nature in a variety, in fact, every discipline, every sector of business, every sector of society, that they can then go out and show how we can make positive action for nature and kind of make positive change for the next generation.
That sounds great. I mean, I was really struck this morning in the session after coffee break that we still don't really know how to communicate to different audiences really well. There's so much more social science we need to do on behavior change to really kind of hone how we communicate this. So hopefully we'll have all those interdisciplinary students entering the workforce very shortly. So I've got one more question for each of you now on collaboration, but I'm going to challenge you to answer it quickly so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So I do want to focus on collaboration because that's what this panel is about, really. And I think it is, it sounds easy, but it is actually quite hard to get that right and to really understand how we meet each other's needs in this challenge. So I'm going to come to you, Tom, first, because you know Nature North is all about collaboration. What's been the biggest lesson you've learned about collaboration? What's been really tough that you've conquered and come out the other side?
Okay, so I think the biggest lesson we've learned is that people really want to collaborate. So as I say, across different sectors, across different organizations. I mean, as you know, I'm here because I work quite closely with the RSPB on one of the investment propositions. We genuinely don't feel like different organizations, which is amazing, I think, to have come to that point. The challenge, though, and it's really boring, and I'm really sorry for even mentioning it, is data sharing. So we've actually got a portal where all the environmental organizations, all the infrastructure organizations are sharing spatial information, assets at risk or nature projects in one place. But because building something like that, you can't have kind of multi-way data sharing agreements between everybody within the group. So what you have to do is effectively use mainly open source data, which then isn't quite as powerful. So it's a bit of a boring answer, but data sharing is definitely a challenge. There are some other ones as we're starting to bring in money around transparency of whose projects get into the portal and whose projects get chosen. But in some ways, that's a really nice problem to have because it means that people want the money that's starting to flow. Okay,
that sounds really interesting. And, I think data is often a big challenge in kind of how do we mobilize it to tell us some big truths. Yeah. Joe, I'm going to come to you next because you've got a long history of collaboration to deliver those catchment projects you were talking about. What are the big lessons that you've got from the business side about how to collaborate well with the NGO sector?
So I suppose water industry and water companies aren't really necessarily your typical businesses. We operate across infrastructure and different communities and local authorities all the time. We had a fabulous project that we did within Greater Manchester, working very closely with the combined authority, the NGOs, the Environment Agency, and it was funded through the EU. So it was through EU Life project, and it was called Natural Course. And that was all around how do we collaborate together to improve the water quality in Manchester's rivers. And the sort of key thing for me was making sure that all organisations provided a dedicated resource. So we had to put our money where our mouth was. This isn't just about people doing it on the side of desks. It's about creating this as somebody's role. And then we got those people to work together. So on a Thursday, they all came to Manchester and they took off their corporate badges and they sat in a room together and they worked together. They didn't have a meeting. They didn't just talk about issues. They tried to work and overcome those issues together. And that still persists. So now we have a way of working, which I've talked about before, about integrated water management. And we still work with all those stakeholders and have that same approach to collaborating together. So for me, it's about that. How do you take off corporate badges? Because we're all here to try and do the same thing. That's
very similar to what you said, really, isn't it? You've got to feel like one team for nature on this challenge. And there is something about people do things for other people. So it's that sort of social bond that you create with that team. Perhaps we overlook that a bit. We've got to develop more of those personal relationships first. And I'm just wondering, Anna, thinking about what you were saying about the interdisciplinary approach, how easy do your students from different backgrounds find it to collaborate? Do you have to work at that, or is that something that comes quite naturally? And have you got any lessons you can share about how to bring the different sectors from humanities to social science together and natural science?
Yeah, I think on the first point, no, not that much. I mean, definitely it's been a bit of a challenge for us in the teaching team because people come in with different levels of expertise. So there has been that learning for us in terms of how we make sure that everybody has that shared knowledge. But actually with each other, it's been so amazing to watch. I mean, our target was 16 students. We got 32 in September. And so we had this amazing just bunch of enthusiasm in the room. And what has been so inspirational is that it is their shared love of nature. And it is that passion and drive to make a difference. And I think the solution to this, it's a bit of a different answer, but I think it's a kind of root and branch one, And I think we need to really invest deeply in nature connectedness. Miles Richardson has done some amazing work at the University of Derby looking at this. I don't think it's a coincidence that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and it's also one of the least nature connected. And I think we need to think about look at a range of different cultures and indigenous communities around the world to look at actually how we can think about this differently. And of course, first and foremost, it starts with education. We know that biophilia is a thing. It's real, that innate need to connect with nature. You take a small child, you put them in a garden or a woodland or a grassland, and they'll start eating worms, they'll start exploring ants, they'll love it. And that disappears, certainly in this country, in large parts of the Western world, as we go through our childhood into teenagehood, and it never returns. And I think we really need to invest in a deep way, because actually, if everybody, from whatever they do, has a passion and an understanding and a deep connection to nature when they go into their adult lives, then we're all got that shared love which actually can bring us together.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, I often think as well that you sometimes see people who are very stressed and busy in their work environments, and they tell you, oh, this weekend I'm going to go and do a fantastic walk in the Lake District, and I'm really looking forward to being connected with nature again, but then don't feel able to take their nature into work with them. And that feels like the big challenge. We need to bring people's love of nature. Do you remember Take Your Daughters to Work Day? I think my poor dad did that. We need to take nature to work day as well. So yeah, just thinking then from you, Edward, with the Business and Biodiversity Forum. I mean, there's some real opportunities coming out of IPBES, we hope. And Katie's worked hard on Chapter 6, so we're all excited about these enabling conditions. But if you had some hope for what will come out of IPBES from the business side for collaboration, what would that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, UK BBF is a membership organisation. We've got HSO members from British businesses, everything from major major brands through to single operating, hairdressing salon in Oxford type of situation. So we're all about collaboration as well. It's the 80 or plus members coming together. And I think we're now looking at, okay, well, what can we do to collaborate with DEFRA, with JNCC, to help bring the recommendations that were all highly anticipated, particularly Chapter 6, apparently, Katie, no pressure, to start seeing how that will play out across the UK policy framework. Stable policy. You don't want, business needs that security of knowing what's coming and that we're not going to have things changing. So yeah, we're looking forward to collaborating with partners, seeing that translate beyond DEFRA, JNCC into the Treasury. How can we start to incentivize with financial instruments and removing the negative subsidies that are actually constantly fighting against nature? It's all well and good when we get great statements from DEFRA and JNCC, but if the Treasury is still massively subsidizing destructive industries, that's problematic too. So I think we need collaboration to try and work our way through to these. And then also, another way I think we'd want to be looking at is collaborating on how can we get disclosure more embedded into the British system, either through financial disclosures or others. I mean, we're coming back to the numbers and the metrics here now. We've got a set of metrics now where we're unifying around. And again, it was a very collaborative process, the Nature Positive Initiative. They're going to be putting out a new set of metrics for disclosure next week. Everyone should go and look at them. But we've got all of this stuff that's being put together collaboratively. Let's, as the multi-different stakeholders in the room today from businesses, also start working with those government partners to make sure that I'm really anticipating this report to be an excellent resource. Let's make sure it's used.
Well, that's great because it builds on where I was going to go with Javed, which was really about the metrics, because the big challenge here, biodiversity is really hard to measure. It's not as easy as carbon. We've got a big challenge in trying to get these metrics. We've got a sort of forest of different metrics, some of which are better in certain situations than others. In terms of how IPBES comes forward, hopefully there will be some recommendations around the kind of metrics that we might adopt. But yeah, how important do you think the metrics are going to be to this next phase of driving forward change to business?
I think that's been the missing link so far, because we've been talking about ambitions, but the action would be only driven by those metrics, as we talked about, the measurable outputs. Because if you think about the corporate boards, they're always driven by measurable outputs and preferably auditable outputs. So assurance is also very important. The challenge would be to produce that micro level data. So we have got the macro level data produced by different matrices, but for a corporation to take action, we need the micro level data for every single business, and that's going to be a challenge. But we have got frameworks like the TNFD as well, and the CSRD, which is the European directive. So I think that is, in a sense, if you think about it, regulations are actually ahead of the practice in this particular aspect. So it's the practice that needs to catch up with the regulations. And once those structures are aligned with the corporate, all these ambitions around biodiversity, I think that's where we will reach the level, but not yet there.
What would give businesses confidence to trial that?
I think some businesses already tried that out. So there are a number of businesses that do try it out, as I said, especially nature-based businesses. But it's about the confidence comes from a robust methodology, and hopefully that will come out at some point tomorrow. So once the businesses understand that this is something that we can try out, this is something that really will help us capture the real impact. And that's what the businesses are worried about, not capturing the real impact. Kind of the numbers may not always tell the real story. So very important to identify the actual metrics that is really relevant for a business. So I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. So we've had my questions. I've been rather lucky. I've got quite a lot of questions for these guys. So now it's your turn. I'm going to turn to the floor. You can put your hand up, and what I'll do is we'll take 3 questions, and then we'll see who wants to answer those 3 questions, so we can hopefully get a couple of questions in. So anyone wants to put a hand up first of all and be our first questioner? We've got several. We've got the gentleman halfway up here with his hand nice and high up. We've got a lady at the front, and then gentleman behind her. So we'll take 3 questions in a row if that's okay. So do you want to go first?
Cool. Thank you very much. So my name's Liam. I'm here from the Uni of Oxford. Studied my undergrad here, so it's good to be back. For Javed in particular, I just kind of wanted to ask, you mentioned how measurement is sort of a key language to communicate with businesses, but you also say that numbers sometimes don't always tell the full story. I wanted to ask then, how then do we deal with aspects of biodiversity that don't lend well to measurement or economic valuation, like intrinsic or cultural relational values? And how do we kind of tie that all in with business and biodiversity?
I think that's a very interesting question, because especially in case of non-financial information, it's not always about the numbers. It's about the narratives that kind of accompany those numbers. So in terms of numbers, we can capture that in various ways. But it's about identifying that narrative and preferably coming from a reliable source. Because we've been talking about assurance, and there are guidelines now about how you provide. I'm trying not to use the term audit because of my accounting background. How you assure non-financial information around biodiversity. So I think that also incorporates narratives rather than only numbers. So this is a very evolving kind of discipline. And as we go along, I think over the last 10 years, there have been significant developments in terms of how to assure those narratives. We're talking about how businesses will gain confidence. I think the confidence will come from some sort of external verification of that narrative. So I don't know if I've answered your question right, but it's a very difficult balance to achieve, but we need to strike the right balance between the narrative and the numbers.
Thank you. With Gemma?
Thank you very much. Gemma Harper, JNCC. Andrea mentioned TNFD, as did a number of the panel. So I'm really interested in thoughts about where we go next with TNFD. Maybe this is particularly for Edward, but also interested in other panelists' views on its potential and what businesses are really looking for in terms of incentivizing take-up.
Brilliant. Well, that's a big question. There's quite a few here. So Edward, do you want to go first? And then I'm going to share my microphone with Andrea.
Thanks, Gemma. And thanks for all your support. TNFD is an interesting one. I think it's brilliant how much TNFD has been picked up on. I think now we're going to begin to see how it gets used on a webinar a couple of years ago, I used the analogy of disclosure is only so good. I can disclose that I ate cake this morning, but it's not going to make me any healthier. So what is going to be done with the information? And I think that's going to be the interesting next step. Are financial institutions going to start making investment policies based on disclosures? Are regulators going to start looking at them and making decisions? Hopefully, yes. Otherwise, the whole theory of change is flawed. So I think that's where the interesting juncture we're at now. It's clearly taken off. It's really driving the conversation and bringing in new language of dependencies, impact, risks, and opportunities. I really want to see that we're going to go further, and it's actually going to drive change in the right way.
Brilliant. Yeah, I actually just also wanted to answer the previous question about intrinsic value. My team and I last week, we were hearing from Google DeepMind, and they were talking to us about the large language models that are now available using AI, which means that you can actually go into indigenous communities and you can actually start aggregating up data from many different languages to understand what the local value is and what that people are referring to. And by using AI, you just get an ability to kind of pull data together and aggregate it in a way that's kind of exponentially kind of explosive in terms of what it's going to tell us actually, in terms of how we put value. And then on TNFD, I think I'd just say three things, I think, Gemma. One is that there's a lot of work that's been going on with the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, which has developed new biodiversity standards, ISO standards 1 and 2. The question is what happens to those next, and then do different countries take them on and make them mandatory in terms of reporting against them? But they now do exist in a kind of standardized international way that is used, the TNFD framework. Then you've got different countries then at different points on the journey, I think, in terms of bringing them into domestic legislation. And certainly hearing the Chinese experience earlier this afternoon, they were like very clear, you know, we make things mandatory and people do them. And they've got a very strong regulatory system that is leading to a lot of reporting, a lot of compensation and lots of money moving around the system. But then the third one would be, I think, the biocredits framework that I just mentioned earlier, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. That's essentially a framework where companies can essentially do insetting, so they can quantify. So they do the TNFD framework and then they go, oh, we're really massively dependent on nature and we're massively kind of lacking in resilience. And they can use that to basically bake in resilience in a really quantified way that puts it on their balance sheet, basically, in a way that they haven't been able to before.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I really appreciate that. Did anyone else want to send anything on TNFD as well? Other than I would say it's going to be so important that it drives action. So, you know, it's great to live in a democracy. I'm not dissing that, but it is wonderful to hear about enforcement action and making things mandatory, because sometimes this is all a bit too optional. And I do think we need to drive change. We do need to see leadership on this. And that is absolutely critical to seeing things through. So, yeah, great. We've got a gentleman on the side here.
Thank you. Yeah, listening to Joe Harrison talking about biodiversity and the relationship with United Utilities, it seems like a no-brainer because it has a direct correlation with their product, water. But what about urban-based businesses working in large offices in the centre of Manchester, I don't know, software businesses or large companies of lawyers, for example, or others that maybe don't feel a connection with nature? What do you do about businesses like that who see social value as the way they treat their staff, which is, of course, legitimate, but how do you redirect their attentions and their efforts to nature and biodiversity?
It's a great question, because so often with biodiversity, it's the tragedy of the commons. Everybody's small part is so small that they don't feel it's worth making the change. But somehow we have to show how that aggregates up to a bigger impact. So does anyone want to take that one? Joe?
I mean,
sorry. You go first, Anna, and then Joe.
I mean, I think in urban environments, it's really actually easy to see if the sun shines in Manchester, which it does do occasionally. All of a sudden, Manchester Piccadilly is full. The Piccadilly Gardens is absolutely full of people going outside and being outside. And I think what that shows is that actually, it was kind of what we were saying earlier about that people do have that connection to nature. It is about demonstrating that relevance. And I think the more that businesses actually report on what they do, I think more demonstrating it's about actually people that encouraging those businesses to demonstrate how, whether it's software or lawyers, you are still having an impact on nature in some way. And I think it is that it's creating that community of care that actually we can make a difference in terms of what this organization is doing, whether that is through offsetting because your software is contributing to actually carbon loads or whatever, but actually also selling that, telling your employees what about that. And also, I think, encouraging those employees to have opportunities to go and connect in nature, to whether that's corporate volunteering days, but actually allowing them to have that opportunity to connect with nature as part of their job, I think is really important.
So did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it's coming back to the conversation that we were having at the beginning about resilience. I think actually sometimes it is hard to engage organizations about biodiversity, but if you talk about nature recovery and you talk about the consequence of climate change and how that's going to impact people's businesses, then you start to get a little bit more of a connection. We did a great piece of work up in Cumbria a couple of years ago, where we sort of started off on a trajectory of talking to farmers about reducing nitrogen use and reducing their use of fertilizers on land to improve river quality. And we soon became aware that Nestle were having almost the same conversation with the same farmers, but their interest was actually about keeping fertilizer on land to have more nutrient-rich milk. So it was all about preserving their supply chain, but also to look at how they can reduce flooding from rivers, because when they experienced flooding up in that part of Cumbria, their staff couldn't get to work. And so it was actually, we've had some really devastating floods across the northwest, and we've had several in Manchester in the last sort of few years. And that sort of, recognition that actually people might not be able to get to work, things will be different, it is very tangible and allows people just to sort of think a bit differently.
Thank you. Do you want to go, Tom?
Yeah, I was just going to bring it back to the sort of urban environment in the question. I'm just looking at the bottle here, which is 1% for the planet. And we have a company that supports us, who are a Manchester-based media company, and they give 1% to Wildlife Trust because I think we're very inspired by the work that we do within the city. We've got a long track record of working with Manchester City Council. And I think sometimes as organizations, certainly in the NGO sector, we do have to work in the places where people live and form that connection between local green space and nature as part of the day-to-day experience, rather than something you have to go to, and then associating that with an organization that they might like to support. So we also have we got funding to do a project down in Wythenshawe in South Manchester. And there's a really inspiring example. Actually, one of the guy who pulled this off is actually at the back of the room. And it was amazing because we were doing a project in the area, and then someone who was the CEO of a local business, he'd been born in Wythenshawe, and he was like, people like you don't normally come and do projects in a place like this with sort of, council estates and degraded bits of City Park. And actually that observation and seeing the care of working with the local community in that place grew into what we call a nature positive partnership of about £350,000 through a conversation and just being inspired by what we were doing to a place that he cared about. So I think you mentioned earlier on about that love and the biophilia. And I do think that this world of business to business, it is around resilience, it is around mandatory markets. But if you can inspire people working for a business or in charge of the business that, that you are a way of channeling their love of nature and their love of their local place and putting them together, that could be a really, really powerful thing the
combination of supply chains and really understanding actual footprint impact, but also that connection to place. And I sometimes think that, some of the connection to place, we're quite localized here in the UK, but understanding connection to other countries where the products are coming from and feeling that connection. I've got the wonderful joy of working with birds, so being able to explain our connections through migratory pathways, I find that's a great way of talking to people about how they feel connected with a larger landscape. I'm getting the signal we have to wrap up, but I'm very aware, Edward, you wanted to come in on this. So
I'll just try and be quick. I think whilst with some of those businesses and situations you mentioned, there's things that they still can do, be it buying bird-friendly coffee or looking at what papers in the printer. They're also potentially ones that have the opportunity for the transformative change, which was another best report. Maybe the law company can have different fee structures for nature related practices. Maybe the software company can look at ways of nudging whoever's using their software to make different purchasing decisions. So I think there's always things that we should be looking on the other side. Actually, how can each of us as companies and individuals influence other people's behavior to bring about that societal change?
It's a great point to end on, I think, because all of us leaving here today will have our own influence and agency in the world. And one of the things I think we all have to be is active citizens. So we really need to take our passion for nature, make sure our elected political representatives know that you care passionately about nature and you want them to act, hold them accountable for it, but also in all of the products that we buy and the footprint we leave, we want to make sure that we are driving that passion and ambition we've had in this room for nature together, and be making sure that we're making those good choices as well. So thank you all very much. I'm just going to hand over now just to wrap up to our wonderful hosts here at the Alliance Manchester Business School. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. My name is Fiona Devine. I'm Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at the University of Manchester. And my role is very much to close the event this evening. So I think you'll all agree we've had a fantastic discussion here from our expert panel, but also you've had the opportunity to ask some questions and also participate in the discussion. And what we've been hearing about tonight is so many aspects to diversity recovery, and how for this to be successful, it's going to take so much collaboration and partnership. And indeed, the event that we've got here tonight is testimony to that fact, that we've got government representation, business, civil society organizations, and ourselves at the academic community. And of course, I'm especially proud as Vice President and Dean of Humanities that we've got amazing researchers here in our geography department, for example, doing amazing work on peat bogs, and not very far from us in the Lake District, to, dare I say, auditing and the role of nature in auditing by our colleagues in accounting and finance. Incredible interdisciplinary work going on here. And as you've been hearing about, we also have been developing programs specifically in this area. You've been hearing about this amazing one on the MSc in Nature, recovery, is it recovery? I can't even, restoration and rewilding, and I have read all about rewilding. But we also, a couple of years before that, also created the the Masters in Business, Sustainable Business. And again, what we're doing with these programs is looking to build capacity and create the next generation of leaders who really value nature and do lean into it. And these are hopefully the next generation of people, but all alongside you, who are going to have impact, who are going to really lead on actions so that we do sustain long-term system change. And I think from all the discussion here, we can be hopeful. Sometimes there's pessimism abounds, but there's lots of hope here of all the interest that we've got from so many people, from so many organizations collaborating together, wanting to get that long-term system change. So can I just take this opportunity to thank everyone, to thank the panel, especially Andrea, Katie, and Katie Jo, to thank all of you for participating and coming along. I hope you found it really interesting and enjoyable. We've been delighted to host you here at the University of Manchester. And finally, just one last plug for that QR. Keep moving, that's it, that QR. So there is the opportunity, if you take the photo and do the right thing, to continue the conversation, because we would really appreciate the ongoing discussion on some of the issues discussed tonight. But thank you very much all for coming. Thank you.